Urban legends and myths are a staple to a more hidden side of every community. Whether it's a cautionary tale about a location in a city, or a creature tied to an entire state alone, they're sure to capture your attention and drag you down rabbit holes, especially with the obscurity of horror alone. So today, we'll be covering gaming's best obscure and creepiest urban legends. From an arcade machine controlled by the government to an indie game tied to someone's death, let's talk about the most disturbing myths in video games. Starting off with Polybius, an arcade machine ran and developed by the government. Based in Portland, Oregon, in 1981, the government decided to test arcade machines through psychological experiments. One day, a few arcade machines just showed up in a couple local arcades. This game, being a tube shooter with drastic flashing imagery, catching the attention of locals, lines and lines of people would queue waiting for their turns. These arcade machines would produce addictive chemicals upon people who played their game, making players feel a multitude of side effects from amnesia, hallucinations, and insomnia. Random men in black would visit the machines and collect the data about the people playing the game. All of a sudden, a month after it was put into arcades, every machine disappeared at the same time. Of course, all of this isn't real, but the story behind it is pretty fun to imagine, pitting the government for another public experiment for control. It all started from an obscure website in the early 2000s on coinop.org, most recognizably featured in a 2003 September GamePro magazine, issue 180. Where the popularity really rose. This sparked media from then to more modern ones to pick up this urban legend from 2006's Please Homer, Don't Hammer Him Simpsons episode and 2021's Journey into Mystery Loki episode. So the media is still going strong with it for 15 years now. So we know it's fake and has had large media attention, but the real mystery is what Polybius is based off of. Perhaps the real government involvement in arcade machines, whether they were being used for gambling or drug smuggling, and general tampering, which caused them to be pulled without trace. Or the real events of people putting so much time into games that players collapsed, such as a Tempest or Asteroids incident, and one person even passed away due to an undetected heart problem, which I'll cover later. Several other games similar to the idea of Polybius, like The Last Starfighter or Cube Quest, regardless of the origin, the rabbit hole is interesting. And with almost infinite theories and new information, it's a great topic for a full video. The most disturbing of any of these comes from Sad Satan, a deep web game covered by Obscure Horror Corner. A subscriber of the channel gave a tip of a Tor site where they could find a disturbing game from the dark web. The game has a black and white visual with a multitude of audio from music to speeches and disturbing screaming from people. The channel's creator was interviewed by Kotaku and a link was given along with the subreddit surrounding the game's mystery. The link was false and not entirely known, but most likely due to sensitive material in the game. Someone on 4chan claimed to be who supplied the link and said that Obscure Horror Corner didn't show the true Sad Satan. This link this person gave showed real gore and CP, truly messed up. Along with this, there was a ton of malware which caused devices to slow, crash, and even stop working altogether. People tried to use backdoor options like a USB launcher, but that also crashed. Overall, the beginning seemed more creepypasta-like with some minor sensitive topics, but turned much darker when the 4chan user released the true version of the game with real illegal horrors. That's where this one gets the urban legend title. A fake game that became more than you could imagine with what someone released. This did eventually lead to Gary Graves being arrested. The man linked to the 4chan account, and as for Obscure Horror Corner, he disappeared after releasing 5 short videos showing the game. That's where this story really comes to an end, as we still don't know the true meaning of the game, just that it was sabotaged in the light of its peak and forever going down as a real urban legend. The last game was pretty obscure, but this is probably the least known. Kill Switch, a game that deleted itself after it was beat, so it was concluded that it might not even exist. A simple visual of white and black monochromatic horror survival game, released in 1989 by a Russian company, where you play as 2 characters, Porto, the female protagonist who changes sizes to navigate the abandoned mine, or Ghast, an invisible demon who shoots flames out to attack enemies and to show where the player's at. You explore a coal mine, which you were a former employee of as Porto, defending against dead employees, coal monsters, and demons. You find files and recordings among your dead employees to find out what caused everything to spiral into this. With the recordings, you found out that inspectors were sent into the mines to gather information, and they would head into the mines with red-coated men as they plunged blades into the workers to keep their work continuing. Eventually, the machines that were being worked with brought the dead back to life, driving the red men out of the mines, but these machines were neither graceful nor biased towards workers, as they were often killed alongside. There's a lot more to this story, such as Ghast, whose level you couldn't complete as it was too challenging, and the last copy being sold in 2005 for $733,000 with intent to record the game, but no trace ever came from that person. To really sum it up, it seems like another political game. An awakening to the wider public on the Soviet industrial practice, and the name of the company being Karvina, which is a town known for coal mining in the Czech Republic. More recently, it was discovered to be a short story published in a 2013 book called Melancholy of Mecha Girl. So, kinda spoiled it, but there's the origin. On to probably my favorite one. Why? Because I'm a slave to Bethesda games. The Morrowind Insanity mod, a more lighthearted urban legend. Something more likely to scare some pansies like me, but still pretty interesting if you know the game. There was a mod made back in 2005 for Morrowind, titled Assassin by JVK1166Z. The mod strikingly changed far too many things in the game than thought originally. The primary one being most of the NPCs that you would encounter, some to even progress through the game, were caught dead, their corpses constantly plaguing their alive locations. The only NPCs that were alive said "watch the sky," or more commonly, nothing at all. You were also constantly being damaged by the assassins of the mod. Another large focus of the mod was a dungeon that displayed images from your PC's folder and contained a locked door that once interacted with would change the sky of Tamriel. It mimicked the same one as the present night sky, such as what the NPCs were saying. One of the players using this mod stared at the sky for 24 hours, waiting for whatever would change. At some point, the night sky was almost directly in line with the date in 2014. He decided to look around, but with no recognizable NPCs, he just noticed new ones, except each of their eyes were bleeding. After waiting another period of time, the player noted that the assassins in the game controlled some of his movements and direct the NPCs to all gather and continue to say, "Watch the sky." This is when the sky goes black and never changes back. Out of the game, the player starts dreaming of the assassins as they'd shriek at him atop spindly spider legs. Imagine that. That last part is pretty disturbing, if you have a good imagination that is. So this mod was so horrifying that it made you dream nothing but the horrors that entailed the game. Although it doesn't actually exist, that doesn't stop the spirit of keeping this mod alive. With the story coming out after Oblivion, it still got a lot of attention, and with the release and modding community a year later with Skyrim, it kept the dream alive and on players' minds. A subreddit was also made to investigate this mod, and it led many to understand it was fake, but to also recreate it. The fun idea is, although the mod is fake, there are several aspects of every Elder Scrolls game that is sure to give you the creeps anyway. So it's not as much of a far-fetched tale as you may think, and if you want the type of horror, it is somewhat accessible. On to a horror text adventure game. From 2005, it's known as Pale Luna. It wasn't widespread outside of San Francisco Bay, so with no copies remaining today, it's again hard to track if any of it is real. You wake up in a dark room with gold, a shovel, and rope. The only command that will work is use rope, which states that you've already used it. You can also just leave the room and be met with 3 directions to go, but choosing any other than north crashes your entire game, and each time you progress, it would repeat directions until about 5 hours into playing, a user discovered new text. Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths, the ground is soft. Here. Once again though, it requires another hour of trial and error. The final combination to progress were dig hole, drop gold, fill hole. The game displayed congratulations, with coordinates 40.24248 and 121.4434. The user decided to map these coordinates and see if they really have any meaning to them in the real world. The next day, he adventures out with a shovel on a hunch of unburying something. He followed the relative path of the game, and once reaching a patch of disturbed dirt, he decided to dig until the point of hitting something, which when he did strike an object, he found that it was the decomposed head of a blonde little girl. Immediately dialing the police in horror, she was identified as 11-year-old Karen Paulson. Efforts were made to track the programmer down. With the anonymity of the site, it was nearly impossible. The story is a pretty creepy and interesting read. Obviously not real, the creepiness of you waking up in a dark room with all the items of burying and murdering someone, that being of a little girl, the idea of the game being made for a sick enjoyment of a murder to remember the directions of the girl's body and memories associated, and the coordinates really leading the player to the location of the body is pretty disturbing. Then the name itself, Pale Luna. Pale, as in a dead cold body maybe? Luna, as the symbol of femininity. So a different title of Dead Girl just doesn't have the same ring as Pale Luna. One thing to really debunk everything were the coordinates. They lead to a spot in the ocean, so it's not real. Onto a deep dive conspiracy and myth for a beloved game, Secrets of Evermore, a fantastic and well-praised SNES Japanese role-playing game, but weirdly only produced in the States. focusing around a boy and a dog who get sucked into a world called Evermore. It's a lighthearted game, but with perhaps a terrible secret. A blog was posted about some minor things he found off in the game. A magazine talks about a line saying, "How can you live with what you've done? Those poor children." The context being, one of the developers found out that the people working on the text really sifted through the game's dialogue the last few months. Prior to this, it was common to hear some darker tones thrown in by an amateur leading team, which had to be honored if they requested something. So for months they worked on darker plots and gameplay, which seemed to disappear near the gold release, to the developer's surprise. Back to the dialogue, it stated that at some point in the game, the main character had been in the position of hurting, if not maybe killing children. Besides the instance that the game used to be dark, there is still one thing later in the game that is dark without context. A character known as Queen Bluegarden gets fed up with you ruining her plans, so she hurls herself off a balcony to crush you, but misses, plummeting to her death by breaking floors of the castle. It turns out she was a robot, but the idea of no dialogue being there and seeing someone jump off a balcony without the context is a little frightening, especially for a kids game. The original post also refers to some of the game's locations before the release, and you can see from the picture shown here that a few of the before and after do have a drastic difference, which yes makes sense for making it more vibrant as a kids game, but also could be covering up the game's pre-release dark concepts. At the end of the day, this is 100% a kids game, and someone found some small quirks in the game to turn it into a small horror concept. The idea behind it is a neat and fun read if you want to imagine a childhood game with a little bit more terror in mind. It reminds me of old theory videos either on YouTube or around the web, pointing out glitches and unrecognized details that could mean something deeper, so I'm a little biased in this entry. On to our final entry. We started with the well-known arcade machine myth, now let's uncover a real terrifying secret surrounding an arcade machine. Let's face it, video games cause all sorts of violence, like how negatively looked on kids are religiously playing GTA, right? Or at least that's what people like to think. What is real are some deaths attributed by games, or around games, specifically the game Berserk, a 1980 arcade game. It's April 3rd, 1981, then 18-year-old Peter Bukowski visits the local Friar Truck's game room. Deciding to slot a few coins into Berserk, he sets a high score and proceeds to play again. Then again, hitting another high score. So, 2 titles on the board, he's satisfied and walks away, but after a few steps, he collapses. EMTs arrive, take him to the hospital, but he's pronounced dead. The cause was thought to be the game itself, but it was due to multiple reasons. He walked about 4 miles to the arcade with friends in snowy weather, and by the time they were there, he was breathing heavily from the walk already, and jumped into a game to achieve a high score twice, ultimately raising his heart rate and killing him. So it's an unfortunate time and place. 6 years later, after Peter's death, this time being a 17-year-old, Edward Clark Jr., visiting the same arcade as Peter. It was said that he found a few coins on the Berserk machine when he decided to play as well, but another patron, 16-year-old Pedro Roberts, stated he left the coins on top. Arguing in the arcade, they were kicked out separately, but after a while, Pedro snuck up on Edward and plunged a blade into his chest, killing him shortly after the EMTs arrived. And there we have it, some real video game horrors to dwell on. Not directly the game's fault, just happened around them, and it's an interesting topic to bring up nonetheless, and deaths being a beginning to creepy things surrounding video games, as they were in their early stages. There was a fake case as well, known as 666 Berserk Death, or the Jeff Daly case. It's similar to Peter's, he scores a high score and suffers from a heart attack, and another most likely fake case of, you guessed it, another heart attack, which Berserk's designer Alan McNeil stated in an interview. So perhaps Peter's death sparked some other stories to capture Berserk's likeness in urban legends, which it's already solidified since the game actually caused a few deaths. And there we have it, some of video games' creepiest urban legends. From some very simple and almost comical topics to ones that start off normal and take a deep dive into greater turmoil. I think there's no doubt that the fascination behind many of these is sure to stick for a while, and produce other stories around them, such as Sad Satan's much darker origin. It could be a matter of time until someone really does associate a game with real-life murder, like Pale Luna, or a real hidden entry lurking behind a game's superficial concept.